As a young girl awakens to her adolescence, so does her psychic powers. That's basically, of course, the story of Firestarter. We'll be looking at the original 1984 and the more recent 2022. I'm John Chang, Dan Edmonds.
There. I was going to say, wow, that sounds awfully familiar to a TV show we've been watching recently. I was kind of hoping that you'd start this by saying, she's the Firestarter, Twisted Firestarter from the Prodigy song, but you didn't. So anyway, yeah, 1984, yes, and the 2022 remake.
Before we kind of dive into that, I feel like a interesting kind of segue is with the recent, Amber Heard, Johnny Depp defamation, trial, stuff like that, and also, like just the stories of Drew Barrymore. I feel like the intersection is this idea that, like, in some ways, like kind of we put these folks on these pedestals, and yet, like, it's almost like we're setting them up to just, fall off of these, like, like they just, it's almost like kind of we're creating this situation that they're just bound to kind of like not only disappear or disappoint us as these kind of quote unquote idols and heroes, but in other ways, just like we kind of try to make them out to be something almost like godlike, as we kind of talked about with of course the boys and stuff like that, and yet it's kind of like just it's almost like just creating this situation that's just bound to happen in some ways.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of one of the most interesting things about The Boys is I think it, as we said, we were talking before this. I think it has some more, insight into celebrity culture and the egos that go that sort of battle in the background in that than it does necessarily about superheroes. But I'm afraid I'm not the best authority to provide input on Amber Heard and Johnny Depp because I haven't watched any of that trial at all. In fact, the only bit I watched was when the verdict got doled out to Amber Heard, just to see the sheer amount of money she had to pay out, and I just wanted to see the look on her face when someone tells you, you got to pay someone like God knows how many millions of dollars it was.
Right.
It looked like a very humbling experience for her at that stage, but yes, I mean, sorry, I haven't watched any of that, I'm afraid.
No
I heard lots of people talking about it, but in terms of, I mean, as we said, in terms of The Boys, it's like there's a lot of stuff that goes on in the background that we're shielded from, and we have unlike there's just a product of a movie or a TV show that has a marketing force behind it. Celebrities are almost a brand in themselves, much like I suppose YouTubers are or anything else, but it's obviously a much more managed brand. And then of course there's also then you have the franchise brand is like, Marvel has to be in a certain way and you can't plot leak or do anything else on pain of death. So yeah, I mean,
what I find really meta was that with Drew Barrymore, as we're going to get into the 84, she's like just going to be 9 years old as this, the 84 was shot and stuff like that. And the thing is that, like, she was coming off of like kind of the quote unquote fame of E.T. And then kind of a few other kind of similar roles and stuff like that. And like, here's this child, she's not even a teen yet and everything, and like she was already starting to go into bars, like kind of like hang out in these nightclubs and stuff like that. And this was the 80s, this is the height of like kind of the whole drug culture and everything, like kind of. So you can just imagine like what that is basically creating for it, because like a normal child, right, would never be able to kind of get, I remember trying to the whole fake ID thing, whatever, trying to just basically get into a casino to kind of pull a couple pulls on the slot machine, and that was like kind of like risky business in some ways and stuff. But here's this kid who, like, it's Drew Barrymore, kind of, and she just basically hang out with like these adults, and like she even said in like at one point, kind of, she was always hanging out with the older crowd that was more sophisticated stuff. And then, part of it is that, she says that, if you play that game for too long, you forget who you are. So I feel like, like kind of, it was just no wonder then a few years later after, kind of Firestarter, she ends up in rehab, like as a 13-year-old and stuff.
That's nuts, isn't it? Yeah, no, it just seems like certainly in the 80s, Hollywood was devoid of any adults with any common sense. It's just like you said, escort her out of the bar, go and play in the playground. It's just ridiculous when I think of my own daughter, who's like coming up on 9 years old, and to think of that, I mean, it's just
right,
just so it's just totally ridiculous that this is allowed to go on, really.
So for me, the more meta kind of aspect is like kind of, I feel like that's kind of like the Firestarter, is like she's like realizing her power as a celebrity, and like, getting to let the bars and stuff. And then next thing you know, like, she's like letting loose, like, like in fact, that's kind of how she, like her mom finally didn't know what else to do with her. So she kind of just basically, like had like what's called couple of family friends, whatever stuff, just drive her to the rehab center and stuff like that, because they basically were throwing up their hands as to what else to do at that point.
Yeah, ridiculous. Letting it get to that point was probably the mistake, really, that you shouldn't have made in the first place. But yeah, I guess when millions of dollars and fame and everything else comes in the mix, it's difficult to keep control of this stuff, really. It probably, yes, situations probably spiral out of your control very easily. I mean, it's hard enough to necessarily keep a bunch of like 8 or 9 year olds under control at a birthday party around a swimming pool, let alone like in Hollywood where their stakes are that much higher. So yeah,
definitely,
I appreciate that. So, but yeah, having said that, though, in the 1984 version, I think she does actually a good job in that she portrays a 9-year-old girl who is sort of quite confused about her powers and what she can do, and overreacts to things like this. Is pretty realistic from my experience of 9-year-old girls, I would say. But I mean, aside from her, it's quite the all-star cast we've got in the 1984 version. We've got Martin Sheen as Captain Hollister. We've got George C. Scott as the rather dubious Native American Indian Rainbird. Right. I think George Keith is the dad. He's not really
David
big.
Keith,
David Keith, sorry.
Yeah. So his thing was, just double checking to kind of see. I think Officer Gentleman was after this, like, or let me see before. Let me see here, or actually same year. Sorry. So that was like his, and he was like kind of the tragic friend in that one and stuff.
Yeah. But he's one of those actors that you see around in 80s movies, but you may not know by name.
Right.
And you've got Freddie Jones, of course, who we know from Dune, playing the blustering English professor. And let's not forget Antonio Fargas from Foxy Brown and Shaft as the taxi driver, making a brief appearance, as does Moses Gunn from Rollerball, who we saw in that as the Doctor. And of course, Louise Fletcher as the grandmother, who better known as Nurse Ratchet from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And of course, Heather Locklear with her rather fleeting appearance as the mother. So yeah, a lot of famous faces in this movie.
Oh, and Art Carney as the husband of the two, which, ironically, like I never made the connection of him being, kind of Ed Norton from the Honeymooners. I kind of like with this, I kind of like this, of course, is him many years later, playing the kind of grandfatherly, mature role and stuff like that.
Well, I mean, we didn't get the Honeymooners in England, so I have no idea who he is, really, to be honest.
Gotcha.
All the others I recognize, but yeah, not him, to be honest. In terms of other production credits, we have Mark Lester, who's directed it, who's probably best known for Commando with Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yes.
And then a host of kind of okay-ish action movies throughout the 80s and 90s,
definitely.
But not much. Commando would be the only one that I recognized off this list. And from this, you can kind of see why, although not that he does too bad a job. I suppose in a way, Commando is kind of a similar movie, and it's about, a little girl and the father's trying to get her back and things like this. It's similar kind of territory.
Yeah.
And of course, the band Tangerine Dream doing the music for this sort of ambient 80s outfit. Obviously, someone thought, hey, synths work for John Carpenter. Let's give it a try here.
Yep.
But yes, and produced by Frank Capra Jr. So obviously
I know
some
that was
relation
a
to the great
surprise.
Frank Capra. So it's one of those ones where when you see the credits rolling at the beginning, you think, oh wow, maybe this is much better than I remember it to be, because this should be a good movie, you know. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think the basic problem with the original is that like there's a good amount of action for the first episode, and then all of a sudden goes to a
Yeah.
screeching halt, and like it's like kind of like this kind of abrupt jolt, right? Like kind of where they're um you know all of a sudden like kind of after the farm kind of thing, whatever, it just kind of like lap, kind of like, and you're kind of like, okay, when is something going to happen and stuff.
Yeah, I would say, but I would say that the first hour is actually pretty good. I was quite impressed with it, you know, the whole chasing them down and it kind of being revealed about, you know, the parents hiding and being pursued by the shop. I thought, well, that was really good. A lot of pace, a lot of tension. You know, the performances were pretty good. I think what kind of saves the albeit very slow lab sequences is really George C. Scott as Rainbird, because his kind of evil take of manipulating a 9-year-old girl is really kind of creepy, and actually kind of saves that whole section, but it's still very slow, unfortunately. But yeah, so I mean, I think the way they kind of, I think the way David Keith does the dad's role is it's a bit over the top in this case. It's sort of a bit of a sort of a loose kind of, I don't know where he's from actually, because my ignorance of the US wouldn't.
I think it's best like kind of where in the Officer and Gentleman, they kind of jokingly call him the Okie from Muskogee and stuff,
right?
And kind of like really just, I mean, almost in some ways like kind of labels kind of his that kind of country bumpkin kind of accent and stuff that he manages to pull off. I mean, I it seems like I guess that's his natural kind of speaking voice and stuff. I thought it was like kind of something he did just for that role, but I'd forgotten kind of in this one he kind of still does it. So I guess after a while I kind of go, oh, I guess that's how he just really talks and stuff.
Yeah, but I mean, aside from being a little bit on the over the top side, you know, he seems sincere, and he's obviously fairly manic. That's what you would be pretty. Off, you would be pretty manic if you were trying to protect your daughter from the government was after you. You would certainly not be in your right mind.
Meanwhile, you have these kind of psychic powers that kind of, like where you're manipulating people's minds. So it's probably like a lot going on all at once. Because he's kind of partially reading also, I guess, in some ways, people's intentions and stuff.
Yeah, no, I think they did that quite well, actually. And Heather Locklear is pretty wooden in comparison.
Yeah,
she doesn't get much screen time though, to be honest, which is probably a good thing by the judging, by the looks of things.
That's what kind of like I guess I've kind of read that from a few other people. Like kind of it's just such a throwaway role. She does definitely shine a lot more as later on television and stuff. I guess maybe by then she's more hit her stride. I mean, let's face it, like you have all these kind of veteran actors, right? Stuff, and then you have her. It's kind of like who's, like you said, pretty inexperienced and stuff. It's just the inexperience definitely comes through, and luckily, like you said, it's kind of like she's pretty limited for how much what's demanded of her stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, Freddie Jones is kind of, there's this weird thing with the shop in that you have this kind of understated threat from George C. Scott as Rainbird, who's then lethal, and there's various scenes of him sort of chopping people in the face, and there's weird sort of like cuts to like obviously sort of mannequins that are having their faces chopped, and then it goes back to the person and things. But you have Freddie Jones, who comes in as very sort of blustering and over the top to a very quiet Martin Sheen. And then later on in the lab, then Martin Sheen's kind of like really over the top, like, and it's really obvious because like it's really nothing else going on, and then all of a sudden Martin Sheen's like, "My God, this is like, she's amazing," and blah blah blah, and you're like, you kind of knew this already. Why are you reacting like this? Yeah, it was a very strange scene, but that's kind of where the directorial stuff kind of starts to fall to pieces a little bit.
Yeah. It kind of really reminds me of him in the Dead Zone. Like, and he does this kind of similar role, and like kind of in that the presidential candidate who like is kind of like has this kind of weird manic kind of moments and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I feel like I don't know if like kind of if that's the performance they were looking for or kind of but yeah.
I think what happened was Mark Lester was watching it and he got to the lamb. He was like, "Oh man, this is really dragging. We've got to do something to kind of pep this up."
I
We
see.
got Martin Sheen. Let's let him go over the top a little bit here. And I kind of I don't know. I didn't think it was really needed, to be honest with you.
No.
I think that the action of the scene itself was enough. You didn't really need all that. I think they should have focused much more on Rainbird actually, and his interaction with Charlie. To be honest with you, because that was far creepier and far more interesting than any of the other stuff that was going on. To be honest.
Yeah, just one of the most menacing moments was like when Hollister's asking Rainbird, like, what do you want with her? Like, like kind of, that was like kind of like, and I think it's really cool that like he doesn't really say, kind of, like, he kind of says something about like, I want to like kind of be, one with the kind of, I want to feel that power, like kind of, like before he dies.
He says he wants to kind of kill her, and then he wants to see the power so he can kind of absorb it. Basically, is the idea, which is a really sort of weirdly psychopathic thing. And I actually started looking up the character then because a lot, the ancient Indian burial ground is not something we're not. It's a fairly common theme in some of Stephen King stuff, and I thought.
Yes.
Maybe this is one of those characters who kind of reappears in the Dark Tower or something else like this. And I couldn't find him being mentioned anywhere, but he seems like this kind of, the fact that he wants to kind of carry her powers over into the afterlife was a really kind of nutty thing for him to want to do. And I thought, that sounds like the sort of thing King would have built on somewhere else in his universe, but apparently not. But he's very sort of, the whole befriending her as the cleaner who's sort of scared of the dark and then kind of basically wants to kill her is really effective, I thought. And despite the fact that he's not a very convincing Native American Indian, he is a good villain nonetheless. So yeah.
I thought like overall too, like the shop like kind of was such a prototype, like to Stranger Things and Hannah actually, which hopefully at some point we'll watch as well.
Hannah. Okay.
Yeah. It's very similar kind of angle that like some secret government facility is training these super kind of uber kind and stuff and so it's interesting how like these different shows have kind of like really just basically taken that and like kind of found their, own angles or own spins on it stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point we should, if you haven't watched Firestarter lately, especially the 1984 version, you should bring out your Stranger Things checklist and sort of like mark things off because you've got psychic girl with no, missing a father figure, check. Psychic powers that invoke nosebleeds, check.
Yes.
Government agency trying to track down said girl, check. It's father figure who kind of like is there to sort of protect her, like Hopper, check. It's
and Stranger Things. The Duffer Brothers admitted, they admit that like they really were inspired by Stephen King for a lot of their work and stuff like that. So it's like kind of like in other words, they fully admit that they're doing the whole art, real artist steal kind of thing stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I guess I just didn't realize just quite how much was stolen until I watched this. But yeah. I mean, I think there's also, there's what I like about this movie was there were a few moments of just general creepiness that really kind of like, they're probably in the original book, but really kind of like it took me back a sec. And that's the, the bit where the dad catches up with the guys that have killed his wife and are trying to escape with Charlie. And he says, oh, you're blind. And then the other one says, "Oh, you're blind as well." And then you just see them rolling around, clutching their eyes, and you thought, "Oh yeah, God, that's a really terrifying, use of mental dominance." And they kind of tried to. Well, we'll get into the remake in a bit, but I thought that was really cool. Likewise, Rainbird, just wanting to just kill this little girl whilst also spending all this time befriending her was really creepy. And also just this weird sort of the paranoia. And I guess this is kind of tied to the Cold War a little bit, in that you have the scientist and the basically the government sort of official deliberating over this 9-year-old that might be able to create a nuclear explosion with her mind. And there's really nothing that kind of makes you imagine that would actually happen from what's sort of displayed. But it's interesting that you have, these guys behind doors who have these, absolute doomsday paranoia from behind their, in their building, with no actual interaction with this innocent 9-year-old. It's very strange, really.
And it's funny how, like, on the one hand, we have these works of fiction that kind of, go on about it and stuff. And then other times it's popped up, like, I'm wondering how much of it is like kind of where there's some truth to it, that like, there's been research of psychic powers and stuff like that. Because I feel like there was like kind of, along with like kind of the actual physical Cold War, there was like this kind of stuff going on, because like I feel like that because we heard that the Russians were doing research on psychic warriors or whatever, kind of powers and stuff like that, that we felt like we had to kind of have something going on and to see if there's something to it, So in other words, even if like they only got as far as the Men Who Stare at Goats, kind of, that's that one movie with George Clooney that kind of covers it, that like kind of is really a hokey kind of thing of what they were able to do, even if it only got to that point. But I feel like they did throw money at it to try to see how far, how real it was and stuff.
Well, I think The Men Who Stare at Goats is almost one of those things where they intentionally tried to make it more comedic. But if you watch the documentary Third Eye Spies, and you see how much actual work was done with remote viewing, it's pretty interesting, actually. It's pretty compelling. Like, some of these guys had hit rates of like 80% in things that they were able to visualize and draw out and give some pretty precise details to. I watched that when I had COVID and I was in quarantine.
Right.
And then I listened to a few of these books, and it's pretty interesting, actually. I think it's not, I think all these sort of things where people have, most people will have at some stage some kind of precognitive experience that doesn't quite fit in with everything else, or something of a similar line that you can chalk it up to coincidence and things like this. But there's stuff where when it becomes 80%, it becomes a little bit more difficult to completely make that randomized argument, really.
I think that like one thing that the recent Stranger Things episode that thought they did well was that like they had the kids like kind of reading through the National Enquirer, right, which is like kind of one of the tabloid kind of things that was really big in the 80s. And it's funny how like nowadays you rarely, like, I can't even remember the last time I've seen it, like kind of an issue of that on the newsstands and stuff. And I feel like nowadays the internet is like, and social media is like kind of the stand-in for these tabloids and stuff.
Totally. Every other comment and every other window you click on is like the National Enquirer. The next thing on your YouTube list is going to be something, So we don't really need it anymore.
But it's funny how like the kids were turning to that to see if like what grain of truth was within kind of the stuff that like really seemed out there. And I kind of wonder sometimes like how much was that like kind of really the whole thing of like what's called that is art imitating life, kind of.
It's
that like there was actually things like that kind of happened that were like, again, where you had these bat boy ridiculous kind of stories and stuff, but then within there was something that kind of like was a little bit more true than we imagined and stuff.
But one of the most compelling things in this remote viewing thing that I watched was this idea that you could predict the price of silver and gold on the market. So I tried some of that, and I mean, it did kind of go in the right direction from doing the exercises, but I can't say that I accurately predicted the gold price. But man, it'd be nice if you could do that. But yes.
And the other thing I think is that we kind of touched on a little bit is that the power comes at a price. That like you said, with the nosebleeds, and like we're and in fact the remake even touches on that too. That like you don't just get these powers for free. Yes, the sort of micro sort of aneurysms or whatever, the blood clots or bursting blood vessels in his brain was one thing. Obviously, it doesn't affect Charlie.
but yeah, this yeah, the
Well,
idea
at
of
least
how it comes at a price.
at least we don't see that as much in this one, but I feel like, like between Stranger Things and then also like kind of remake, we really see like kind of that the price is the fact that like she's trying to grow up as a normal kid and stuff. And then I feel like that's the other thing that's kind of very meta, because Barrymore again like kind of suddenly became like kind of the Shirley Temple of the 80s and stuff. And meanwhile, like kind of that first string that she had on the set of Firestarter just led her down this kind of path that like she was not gonna like nobody kind of would foresee. Oh well, we can foresee in some respects, but like probably I can just imagine that moment, like kind of where like the cast was kind of like, oh come on, you too, kid, and like kind of and it was kind of like that one-off kind of thing of where like they wanted to kind of not exclude her, right, and so they thought it was harmless and everything, but I feel like it's kind of like that's kind of like the thing of where these little moments that lead to like kind of pretty big consequences and stuff.
Such poor judgment, but yes. Totally. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think what's interesting in another meta way is that this, unlike the remake, this one is much more centered around this idea that she's a little girl that's being put in situations that are beyond her control by adults, more or less. And it's funny because the dad always uses this term of pushing people when he's trying to manipulate them.
Yeah.
And they don't make such a big deal of it in the original, but it's kind of inferred that he might have had to have stopped Charlie from doing things with his sort of power. But it's more like, it's the case of the father stopping her from being able to use her powers fully or trying to sort of suppress them. And then you have sort of the doctor's trying to bring these powers out of her. And then you have Rainbow trying to manipulate her so that she likes him and will see him as a father figure rather than her real father. So it's all centered around this. It keeps the focus on this idea of her being quite an innocent character with a lot of power that she can't necessarily control, that all adults are trying to sort of, and I kind of get the impression that again is a bit like a sort of a child actor who's very, very sort of popular and everyone's trying to sort of cash in on bits of their fame and things like this. So
yeah, it's this really like, I feel like bookends into the things we saw and talked about with Carrie, like kind of where these forces are kind of like just something that it's a more scientific or more like just a really a extension of kind of something scientific. So it's like kind of this hyper what's called about hyper reality, but just something that kind of like can be very real, very like study like these scientists are trying to on one hand study it and stuff, and it's less like kind of like where like in Carrie where it's like kind of like the mother's convinced like it's the devil and it kind of something kind of supernatural and stuff.
Yeah absolutely. It's yeah, they don't even there's a much less of a sort of moralistic or religious edge to it like there is in Carrie. I mean that's because it's her powers are more sort of framed in this the basis of puberty really, and
I was gonna say
like this bodily things that are out of your control that the society deems as wrong and things like this. This is kind of, I guess it's more of it's very much in sort of keeping with what 9-year-old girls who have kind of like temper tantrums and you can't control it. And there's even that bit where they talk about this to say, oh, imagine the baby that can't get its bottle and it's everything in the crib is burning, what do you do? And
right,
so it's it's quite interesting in that respect. Speaking of burning, I think the one thing we should mention as well is that the effects in this are a lot of practical kind of 80s effects. There's a lot of cars exploding, a lot of real fire going on, a lot of very satisfying sort of 80s explosions going on,
yes,
which I personally enjoyed. And so obviously quite a lot of money got spent on this,
right?
I thought.
And I feel like that's what why I remembered it being one of the better Stephen King adaptations was that like that held my attention. It was like we said before that the lab parts kind of really dragged the stuff, but then like kind of throwing in the occasional action sequences that kind of really makes at least a somewhat satisfying ending to it all.
See, this is where Disney and Marvel,
Uh-huh.
they're all going wrong. Just take your cues from the 80s. You need at least one car turning over and exploding at least every episode. A couple of explosions will keep your viewers' attention.
Indeed.
just blow something up at least once. You've got plenty of money.
So in the 2022 version, director Keith Thomas did include a score that had part of John Carpenter's efforts, and stars Zac Efron with a relatively new actress, Ryan Kiera Armstrong as Charlie, and definitely the mother, Sydney Lumet, has a much bigger role and definitely more intriguing. And here we actually have an actual Native American actor, Michael Grey Eyes, as Rainbird, the DSI bounty hunter.
Yes. Yeah, nice to see they actually got that, someone in the role. Yeah, I have to admit, watching the credits for this, I saw John Carpenter's name come up, and I actually that was the most exciting thing for me that came up. I thought, a John Carpenter soundtrack. And I will say this is what I forgot to mention actually in the original, is that I felt the Tangerine Dream soundtrack was terrible in the 1984 one.
It was weird, like kind of, yeah.
It was just a collection of kind of ambient noodlings going on in the background, but they didn't really punctuate any of the action, which was the real letdown. I actually think the 1984 one with the different score would actually be much more interesting, and maybe edit the lab bits down a bit more. But yeah, you could actually make that a better movie just to the score itself, I think.
Because that'd be interesting exercise. Yeah, let's see.
But in this one, I think it actually, though, as we're in the subject of soundtracks, I think John Carpenter did a reasonable job actually with this. Yeah. It wasn't the most kind of inspired, but there were some quite nice bits of stuff that builds tension. Yeah, not one of his masterpieces.
No.
But as good as anyone else could do, I would imagine, given the opportunity. Agreed. So yes, I guess in this we have the acting powerhouse that is Zac Efron as the dad. I wasn't really familiar with the mother as an actress.
Yeah, she's not a huge, but she started to kind of get some roles and stuff like that. And I felt like she really like you can't even compare her performance with Heather Locklear's. It's a more substantial role, and then also I feel like she really rises up to it and stuff.
Yeah. And of course, you do have one of my all-time favorite actors. I should say that I don't even know his name. I want to say his name is Kirk Stewart as the professor.
Kurtwood Smith from RoboCop.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. I mean, he's brilliant in RoboCop. I mean, he's okay in this. He's serviceable. He's pretty over the top, but he doesn't really, apart from one scene, he doesn't really get much.
No. I mean, most of the his role actually is in the title sequence, which I have to ask you because you're I know that's one of your things and stuff. So how did this rate as one of your kind of
you know what, I didn't actually mind it in this for some reason. Okay, I felt like
that's pretty good praise.
Yeah, I felt like it wasn't over the top. It didn't have lots of text, because I hate it when they try and fill in backstory and they actually print things on the screen to say, oh, look, we're printing this because you can't even understand what we're trying to sort of do, in a montage.
Like the whole newspaper headline kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it was kind of, to be honest with you, I felt that scene was, I didn't really want to watch through it again after watching the 1984 one, so I was quite glad they kind of compressed it down and did it quickly. I mean, it had some eyes missing. It was fine.
I felt like what they, overall, like this is like it's a Blumhouse production. I feel like they know the audience, and I feel like they recognize that, like, okay, if we're gonna do remake, don't rehash, the original. Like, kind of like do something, take some things from it, but put some interesting kind of unexpected twists. Because like one of them was the fact that, like, as always, spoilers, Rainbird now has the powers as well.
Yeah, that was kind of an interesting take on it. Yeah, I mean, the fact that as well that Charlie's older in this as well, that she's and she's they introduced the whole element of bullying, and she has to control it, which maybe would have been more engrossing had I not watched it in Stranger Things literally like 2 days before. But yeah, I mean, it seemed it's an idea on paper. It just didn't seem very original, really. It's like kids and horror and bullying. Will they incinerate them or cut their heads off or something? We've seen it quite a few times now.
I feel like that's now becoming a trope, right? And really, like, like, again, like Stranger Things is really just in some ways, like, become like both a standard, but also like kind of where people just feel compelled to rip it off and stuff now, which is kind of ironic because, of course, they ripped off Stephen King, and the original kind of stuff from there.
They just ripped it off better. Yeah. So, I mean, it's kind of, I like the fact that you actually saw her burn her mother properly, and like, it's not just sort of some random oven gloves being lit on fire. You actually saw the damage that she was inflicting on that. That sort of brought home the idea of the difficulty. I guess, Zac Efron did all right, but the one problem I had, the main problem I had with that whole kind of sequence was that there didn't seem to be very much tension. There wasn't like whereas the 84 starts with them on the run and you try and learn as to what led to this. This one is kind of like all very nice and cozy, and we're all a nice normal family, except for they're not allowed to go on the internet. But like you browsing something on Google would give away, your identity, or maybe I'm being too naive. Yeah, maybe it would give them away. They have this quite, they do a decent job of sort of saying this is quite a close-knit family, and then the mother dies, and Zac Efron doesn't really seem very bothered by it. He's like, well, we got to go now, and it was like, I think they did one scene where they tried to get him crying over it, and it just was totally unconvincing. And then they completely break that tension by having what seemed to be a random sort of comedy scene with her half incinerating a cat, and then him going, you better finish the job because the cat's in pain. She burns it. He goes, where do you think she is? And she said, I don't know, like cat heaven or something. And that scene was really quite funny. In fact, it was almost like the highlight of the whole movie for me. And but then it's put in the context of the mother, and it's kind of like, oh yeah, we've kind of forgotten about her, and no one really cares. So that kind of fell flat. Whereas there's a lot more kind of emotional kind of tugging in the original in that respect.
Right.
I thought the actress, I can't remember her name, but who played Charlie did a good job.
I thought she kind of what's called she definitely like it's a challenging role because it's pretty demanding stuff. I have to admit though, also, like, on the other hand, she's no Drew Barrymore, and then Drew Barrymore definitely has like that. She's very convincing as a child who's like struggling, stuff like that. I agree. She did a good job, and at the same time, it's just kind of like, it's kind of, well, here's the other part too we haven't talked about. Part of the whole deal too was like Firestarter was packaged for the fact that Drew Barrymore was like kind of this rising child star and all that kind of stuff, So I think they all realized that, like, back then, that like it was such a it just really, like, a lot of pressure and stuff like that. Here, like, they kind of take off some of it by having Zac Efron's the kind of the star, I guess, so to speak, and stuff, that the I guess the box office pull, is maybe more kind of industry jargon, whatever.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's still a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I think the main difference with her character is because she's older.
Mm-hmm.
You don't get that it, rather than it being a story about adults manipulating a child,
Mm-hmm.
which is far creepier, I think, anyway, as subject matter. This seems more like a kind of a young teenager who's awakening to her own sort of powers and, letting them loose. And it seems like she's actually kind of enjoying the power that she's wielding after a while.
Right.
And she seems far more in control of it than, the 9-year-old Charlie. And in a way, it's almost like this is more of a kind of a power trip in a way than the original. Is more like a kid who can't control her powers, which is kind of fun too. I mean, how we can watch Arnie we can do a power trip. Why not have a girl who can set fire to things as a power trip? But it doesn't. I don't know. It doesn't have quite the same sort of resonance because the rest of the story isn't written from that perspective. So it's hard to shuffle it all around, I think, to
this one, I feel like rather than hinting at the just being purely like a natural kind of phenomenon, stuff like that borders on supernatural, you really like there is something more supernatural to it, because like she talks about like kind of like, I'm trying to stop, it's growing more, you know what I mean, like kind of like she's trying to rein in this energy and stuff like that. And she's and meanwhile, like you said, she's starting to kind of enjoy it too. So it's almost like a semi-possession kind of thing and stuff like that they're kind of hinting at. They don't really go full bore into that, but they kind of just border on kind of saying that like it's some kind of thing that's kind of taking over her and everything.
Yeah, and I mean, there's quite a few. Like you said, you've got Rainbird, who actually has kind of psychic abilities and can sort of has telekinetic stuff, can read minds and track people, across distances. And likewise, she can also do telekinesis. And despite the massive amounts of blood coming from his eyes, Zac Efron's skill is pretty much the same thing. I mean, I thought I did actually kind of like the idea of him making money through being a therapist who basically just kind of like controls people's minds to get them to stop smoking. It was pretty cool, actually.
Irv calls him like so sort of like Tony Robbins. That was kind of.
I know, right? Yeah. Oh yeah, there was another stab at him, wasn't it? The old guy.
Yes.
Yeah, has a go at him, and it's funny. I've seen more and more kind of anti-Tony Robbins stuff floating around YouTube these days as well. It's just like, he started off being a master trying to teach people persuasion, and now he's self-help, but really he's just using the same techniques that he did then. But that's the argument. I don't know. I never watched his stuff, so. There's a whole sort of attack. I think there is a growing cynicism about self-help as well, which is kind of represented in the old man in the house where they visit, which is kind of an interesting. It's those little sort of side things that they throw into movies these days, which are more interesting than the movie themselves, I think, because I think it really does show this attitude, because you can get completely lost in self-help stuff. You can just think, oh man, the next thing is going to give me all the answers. And you can just carry on going from thing to thing to thing, and you think, oh yeah, this will do it. So I think there's definitely fatigue of self-help, which is it'd be interesting to see how that plays out in the next 10 years.
But it also shows like kind of even some kind of farmer, right, in middle America is like aware, like kind of so that's what's interesting, right? Like where as before is kind of more like kind of people who are more educated or whatever kind of thing, more into self-help. But it's like now, like even somebody who like is in some rural American city or town and stuff like that, because it's and part of it is like kind of just the fact that like that Tony Robbins, he even says like like on Netflix, like because even Irv kind of middle of nowhere would likely kind of be watching stuff on Netflix and just kind of maybe scroll through and see that like what's this kind of guru thing, whatever.
Yeah, and I think that's the interesting difference, I guess, in that character. It's funny that he's probably the most interesting character, and it's a bit of a sort of indictment of the movie, really. But Yeah, and the fact that you've, rather than being this sort of elderly couple who are cut off from society, and that provides some sort of shelter or some imagined shelter from the government because they're completely off the grid. In this one, he's there discussing Netflix and how society's going to hell, and it's a show. It means we're all kind of like, you can't really escape anything these days. And of course, I guess you have this interesting thing where rather than the wife being alive and potentially, the caregiver at the end of the movie, she's completely in some sort of coma and can't speak. And this is where they prove the psychic powers to the old man.
Yeah, they definitely expanded on Charlie's powers, because like not only does she the Firestarter, but she's also like you're saying, like kind of has some psychic abilities, and also she's doing like kind of the push too and stuff. Like kind of where she takes the bike away from the boys and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm too much in an old school superhero kind of frame of mind, but I kind of think like, if fire is your power, just stick with the fire. You don't need to have all the other powers, just because actually it makes it more interesting, because then you can kind of have them she can be a team with her dad, because the dad can kind of influence people and she can set fire to things. Like a team then. It's like a superhero team. And you're kind of spoiling that by giving her all of the powers. But the one character who I had major problems with was Gloria Rubin as Captain Hollister.
How so?
I just felt that was just the most wooden performance I've seen. I mean, I'm pretty certain she was in Mr. Robot, and she was much better than that. I just felt like the director, I don't know, I don't know what he was trying to sort of imply with her character, but she seemed like she was stoned when she was delivering those lines. It just,
I guess I felt like she was like kind of playing like kind of uptight, kind of but ambitious government official, so she's trying to be very, kind of buttoned up and stuff like that. I don't know. I guess that's what I felt like they were going for.
I felt like she was vaguely brain dead. It was just like there's barely any humanity at all in there. I wasn't really sure what they were going for there.
Interesting.
This didn't make any sense to me. She just seemed like she was delivering her lines like this most of the time throughout the scene, and that was it. It was just totally. There's
just throwing a few expletives.
Yeah, I mean I don't know what was going. This seemed like there was a few things that just like directorially, if that's even a word, just didn't make sense for me. The fact that they trying to make a comedy scene right after the mother died, and then they have like a scene, where Gloria Rubin's, you have this manic kind of professor, and then she's just there, very kind of like robotic. It was very strange to me, and it was also kind of. It felt just a very small scale, The lab was, thankfully it's short, so you don't have to get through it, but I was still pretty bored by it, because after the mother died and they kind of go on the run, there wasn't really much that happened, it seemed. And I kind of was switched off, I think, towards the last third of the movie, really. I was kind of, there's no big lab explosion or anything like that. There's just some weird CGI and a few people get burnt, and that's about it, really. I suppose you have the Rainbird is the main thing they do, isn't it?
Right.
That's right. Yeah.
I felt like that's kind of like what they did to compensate for the original. Was like, rather than kind of dwell on the lab scene, they just had it as like kind of this dramatic kind of moment, and like kind of where everything kind of comes together and stuff like that. I don't know. I guess I felt for me like just when especially watching it back to back, like versus the original, it's kind of like a relief that we're not going to be sitting in the lab for like the next half hour or whatever.
The problem was I got bored before they even got there. I was looking at like dividend stocks about halfway through the movie because I got bored, and dividend stocks are probably the most boring stocks that you can have, and that was still more interesting than watching the movie itself.
I think that's what each movie reflects, though, is that probably a lot of the novel, and I haven't read the novel to be honest, but I'm guessing that like a lot of it, as a lot of Stephen King stories is like where it's in Charlie's or Andy's head and stuff like that, and things going on. And so there's probably plot-wise not much that happens in the original Stephen King novel. I think that's the thing that they're contending with.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, they tried to sort of reimagine Rainbird's character, and in this one, he's kind of just like a lowly janitor who's been brought out of. I mean,
Mm.
you do wonder though, like, really, would you go from being an assassin to being a toilet cleaner? Is that actually a realistic job? Transition for someone, and then back to being a high paid assassin.
I mean,
It's a
definitely
very odd.
it definitely was more convincing, right? Where in the original, George Scott's Rainbird is, basically portraying that to deceive, so it kind of like, I mean, that's the thing that like maybe in some ways like just he's trying to lay low and stuff like that. I mean, I'm thinking that's like in other words, I'm guessing that like somehow like kind of his money's he's taken care of. He starts trying to have some kind of cover to kind of where basically um, he's done enough bad things like in his day that like he's trying to just avoid people's attention.
Yeah, and that was really the other failing of this, is like they tried to give him a kind of redemption arc, and basically you're taking one of the most interesting things out of the original story, and that's like this person who is like sort of almost sort of rings a lot of pedophile bells by in people's heads by basically trying to sort of almost in groom this 9-year-old kid,
right.
for the purpose of exploiting her powers and then ultimately killing her. It's and the fact that he's just become someone who's got to capture her and then decides that he doesn't really want to do that is a bit naff, really.
And that's the thing that like I'm wondering if like what they were trying to hint at was that like she was awakening to her powers and enjoying it, and so in some ways she was like kind of like almost like like the whole Dexter idea that there's this kind of psychopathic part of her that is awakening, and so like on the surface it seems like he's going to be this kind of like caretaker and like kind of take care of her and stuff like that. But in reality, he somehow maybe like is wanting to groom her rather as another kind of assassin and stuff like that. So I always felt like maybe that's a little bit what they were driving at without saying it and everything.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely they kept it fairly vague. I mean, I kind of interpreted more that he kind of sees the errors of his ways and sort of tries to forgive her and get her to
I felt like
go for a better judgment as well.
I felt like that's like what they were driving at on a kind of very kind of very literal level. I felt like they were kind of vague about it because they were probably unsure which way they wanted to go, and I felt like if the grooming her kind of thing would have been more interesting, but it almost maybe would have been too much, like kind of like just like kind of like because as it is, it's kind of already too much, like you said, that like all of a sudden he has this kind of change of heart, like kind of but supposedly, right, like the one line that kind of for me makes it where it hints at that like something kind of interesting is going on, but they didn't really develop it, was like that he says oh she's my sister, she's my mother and stuff like that. So I feel like they were kind of driving at something, like they were trying to develop some idea, but they never really went far enough with it and stuff.
I just rolled my eyes and I thought, oh, this is like somebody who isn't Native American Indian trying to kind of somehow understand some parts of trying to kind of create their culture in a story.
I felt like, that's maybe what it was.
It felt just horribly contrived to me, and it's just totally unrealistic in that this guy's killed your mother in cold blood, like a few days before. And now I'll go with this guy. This seems like a good way to finish.
I think that's the problem, that they were trying to do too much, like with that, because like if they kind of somehow made it like kind of where he was like supposedly this kind of more spiritual person, right, and stuff, then maybe somehow like it's kind of hinting at that, like he sees like kind of this being that's kind of that Charlie is embodying and stuff like that, whatever, on and on, kind of more this kind of other angle. But I think like that's probably like just too much, because like you said, the guy's a psychopathic killer. Like, I mean, he didn't really flinch too much, up to that point of like, killing all these people and stuff. So why all of a sudden, like, kind of, just at the right moment, he feels like kind of, this, I don't know, like connection with Charlie, whatever, stuff like, yeah.
I mean, ultimately stories revolve around your bad guys. If you wanted to make him spiritual, like who do you want to watch? A movie about Darth Vader or Qui-Gon Jinn? You want to watch a movie about Darth Vader, just make him the bad guy. It's not, no one's going to sort of, I think people can accept that it's okay to have like a Native American psychopath killer in this. It's not going to, I think we're okay with that. We can do that. Yeah, it was just a missed opportunity in my opinion. You should have just stuck with the original on that. And that's what I kind of liked about the original. It's like, she's there watching this guy kill her father, and then she just burns the whole place to the ground, And in this one, it's kind of like, well, she then burns her father. I suppose she kind of does that in the original, but it doesn't seem like a kind of an act of unrelenting sort of anger and passion. It feels just like, oh, I'm going to go down this corridor and burn people. It just lacked any kind of dramatic kind of ending. And I'm guessing a bit of a CGI apart from that kind of halo of fire and her shouting and throwing her hands forward. There was nothing really burnt or exploded. Again,
right.
No satisfying 80s effects. So
I thought one thing they did do well was, like basically when Andy's kind of talking about his regret over killing, those agents and stuff like that, he's, discussing about, like, oh, they have families too and everything. And then it kind of heightened more, like kind of the fact that like when that one tech, right, shows up and, he's kind of talking to his wife, his pregnant wife for that matter, stuff like that. And then so when she kind of nukes him, we do feel a little bit more like kind of like, I don't know, the fact like kind of like kind of she's going down this kind of dark path and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, she's not like the kid who's doing it out of this. She's like sneaking in. She's like stealthily. She's like, commando going in and then burning people in their cars, swiping the key to get in. And yeah, it all becomes a bit James Bond with fire to telekinetic power at that stage. Yeah. And as I say, I mean, the fact that the climax of the movie is basically a concrete corridor with Zac Efron at one end and Rainbird at the other, and the only thing that kind of like just to sort of spice it up visually, they just have the guy in the security camera who's there going, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit, like this. And it's like, this is the only thing that visually stops you from just staring at a concrete corridor for half an hour. It was, yeah. Just not very. I felt there was a lot of stuff that just visually and kind of character-wise just wasn't really conceived very well in this movie. It just didn't seem like a very well-told story, really.
Yeah, I think in the end they were trying to avoid the mistakes of the original, like kind of dwelling too much on the lab, but they kind of instead just ended up rushing through it and stuff. So it's like kind of
lots of other mistakes.
Yeah. But on the other hand, like I guess I didn't. What's called? I think for me, I kind of felt like with Gloria Rubin's, like, because to me she was like kind of this more ambitious kind of sociopath. I felt like less remorse and more kind of like cheering on, like kind of the fact that like she got nuked, like kind of like so. It's like that's that part I felt like kind of worked, because of the fact that like she wasn't as like kind of like she could have been a more sympathetic character, or whatever, but she wasn't quite a mustache twirling villain as much either. So it was kind of like for me, like I felt like she was just the right amount of like kind of evil, I guess.
For me, it was just like she could have just had a far more interesting dialogue, been a more interesting character, and had the shop could have been something. They didn't even expand on what that was. Anything else, there was just no depth there. She was just like the bad guy, and that was it, really. I felt that was another kind of missed opportunity. There was no sort of, at least in the original, they kind of hinted to all this stuff that they did in between with the various experiments and stuff. But I don't know. You kind of, it's one of those things where you kind of feel like this was an opportunity to maybe sort of build the depth, and I don't think they did that. I think they just changed things around, and so there you go.
I don't know. I guess for me, like the remake was, a tighter, kind of more, what's called, it moved like at a nicer pace and stuff like that. The original I felt like kind of really just bogged down, like kind of in the lab and everything. That's kind of like like on the rewatch, because I'd seen it before, and I remember like for me, yeah, the explosions were definitely like kind of what in the end made me kind of go, oh, that's not a bad Stephen King movie, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I enjoyed it when Gloria Regan got nuked because I knew the movie was coming to an end. And but I mean, I was just like Zac Efron. I felt like I was bleeding out of my eyes by the time of that movie finished. If I had to, I mean, yeah, we'll always do our comparison. Which one? I definitely preferred the original, faults and all. I think if you could redo the score, I think it would make it much better. And if you just edited it a little more around the lab, it would be really good. But yeah, the remake was just really, I couldn't sit through that again. I had to take a break actually watching the remake. After about 40 minutes.
Interesting.
Couldn't do it anymore. And I had to
it's particularly interesting because it's a half hour shorter, so it's kind of like that says a lot right there, and it's kind of goes into our point before that sometimes it's funny how something that is shorter and like kind of physically stuff like that, but then it's still in the end can feel like it drags on. I guess for me, the remake, I found it pretty went by pretty quickly, stuff like that. And like kind of for me, like the original, again, like
it is slow though.
Yeah, it just kind of just in those moments, kind of like, okay, we're still in the lab, we're still in the lab, we're still in the lab.
Yeah. So which did you prefer? Do you think if you had to rewatch them again,
right?
would you lean towards?
I have to admit, like now talking about it, that like I did, kind of watch the remake again, just kind of quickly and stuff like that. It's kind of scanning through it for my notes and everything.
Really?
But I definitely don't see ever kind of doing it again. Like like I don't see any. I have to admit that like the original, like kind of as slow as it is, just like you said, the practical effects kind of are just kind of like some of the most 80s enjoyable and stuff like that. And then just for creepiness, you can't beat George C. Scott as like kind of like this killer who like can't wait to get his prize, I guess.
Yeah, and I think for our viewers that really does show John's dedication, that he's willing to watch the remake of Firestarter twice to go through notes. That's above and beyond the Call of Duty, in my opinion. So yeah. How would you have made the remake better? Because that's something we sometimes talk about.
Like when you kind of think about it, like I would say like probably the biggest point is just simply where it was just kind of like a little too much of like where with Rainbird kind of like just like that just suddenly flipping kind of the switch and kind of becoming this good guy, I guess, in theory. I think that was like just a little bit too much of a leap. If they kind of made it where like it's made more sense that like why he would I don't know, like want to like kind of have some evil intention to kind of like I think that kind of would have been more interesting. That like he wanted to kind of somehow take Charlie under his wing to kind of groom her, stuff like that.
Yeah, I think definitely that. I would have liked to have seen the professor and Hollister more in depth as they kind of hinted, but what would they actually do? What was the end game here? Who are the other people they were trying to track down? Maybe there's some more depth they could have added there to what the shop was involved in. And more explosions. It's called Firestarter. I didn't really feel like we got enough things exploding and enough things on fire. They
I mean,
needed to up
they
the
did have
budget
a bathroom fire. We didn't talk about that, and so that apparently was like big enough to get Charlie like almost arrested and everything. Which actually there is actually some basis to it. You know, I don't want to spoil or give too much into it, but apparently I was there's some things that I was watching where they talk about these schools having actual police officers, and sometimes that like they kind of take some of these things a little bit too seriously, and then like, you know, arrest kids for like, you know, something that, you know, is much smaller than an actual explosion and stuff like that.
Yeah, that was I thought that was actually a weird sort of turn, and that the teacher, rather than being concerned, goes from being concerned to being scared of her, which I guess is kind of interesting in terms of they're trying to make her a bad guy, or, you know, trying to play this kind of gray area. Are you rooting for you? Is she an actual psychopath? But I don't know. I think it would have been perhaps more interesting if the teacher had been more sympathetic and they'd explored that in somewhere. I mean, obviously they're not doing a very good job of schooling, because like their kids just openly bullying other children and the teacher's doing absolutely nothing about it.
Right.
I don't know if maybe that's normal, but
I think that was another case where we were kind of like bordering on kind of you know, going the Carrie direction and stuff like that, but then they kind of like, you know, it's like another place that I think they were probably like unsure which way to go with it, and so they kind of went, you know, so far. And then, you know, in the end, you know, kind of, I think they were trying to keep things down to an hour and a half, so they kind of like okay, maybe we can't do that and stuff.
Yeah, I felt like it was, I don't know, I didn't feel like it was part of the original story. Like you said, it's like Carrie does that. This is a different kind of story. Yeah. So yeah, all in all, nothing we'll be watching again anytime soon. But it's another to add to our Stephen King remakes list that we've watched quite a few of now. I'm trying to think if there's any more that we've actually got. We still didn't do the Dead Zone, did we?
That's the only one. And the problem with that is the fact that like there hasn't been a movie remake. There's just the series and stuff. So that's but the first season, you know, kind of like what we talked about before, it's more or less, you know, like kind of that's more or less the what's called the story of the original, stuff like that. Yeah,
perhaps we will go into it at some stage. So I guess what else have we got coming up soon?
Yeah, Death Note coming up. You know, Attack on Titan, what's called along with that. I thought that we might do Top Gun as a remake, because of the fact that like, you know, the fact that like they ended up doing a sequel, which originally, you know, like there was always discussions about like, should we do a remake, should we do a sequel stuff, and then they ended up doing, you know, of course, the Top Gun Maverick and stuff.
Yeah, I think it's close enough to a remake that we can make the excuse to do a thing on it.
Sounds like a plan.
So yeah.
So once again, I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds, and we will see you next week.